Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm so happy you're here. My name is Marianne and on this channel I talk about geopolitics. And today I want to explore how ice melting in the Arctic is opening new sea routes and resource access, transforming the region into a high-stake arena for great power competition, amongst which Russia, the United States, NATO, and even China. So today the Arctic is melting. It is the sad consequence of rising temperatures, and waters that were previously frozen are now more and more accessible and increasingly within reach. A new ocean is opening and great powers are rushing in. It is now the place for a new geopolitical battleground. So the Arctic was once a frozen world, but now it's a new frontier with a race ongoing for the future of trade, energy, and military dominance. So how did we get there? Long-term satellite records have shown a steep decline in summer ice extent. Sea ice extent has shrinked by roughly 12 to 13% per decade since 1979. There are two main routes across the ocean. The first one is the North Sea route or Northeast Passage that follows the coast of Russia, and the second one is the Northwest Passage on the side of Canada. And melting ice is slowly opening those routes, which would be very interesting for international trade. The North Sea route via Russia would potentially be 40% faster than Suez for shipping from Asia. And the Northwest Passage along the side of Canada also emerges as an alternative, though both routes are still contested as international waters. With the ice melting, nations are looking to use the third passage as well. So that would be the future transporter sea routes that would go right through the ocean. The North Sea route sees far more activity, largely driven by Russian destination shipping related to oil and gas extraction. It has also seen seasonal traffic and destination voyages as ice retreats. The North Sea route has a higher volume of bulk cargo and tanker traffic compared to the Northwest Passage. And the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic has also seen more activity, which is primarily related to Canadian domestic resupply, local fishing, research, and a growing number of tourists and pleasure crafts, rather than international commercial cargo transit. Overall, transit numbers are still relatively modest compared to other global routes, but transits are growing. Russia forecasts traffic on North Sea route rising from 34.9 million tons in 2021 to 130 million by 2035, turning the corridor into a strategic export artery, especially to Asian partners. Whoever controls those waterways control global trade flows, exactly like Suez or Malacca. So the map is changing and sea routes are opening with new choke points. In the ocean and under there is also a vast resource potential: oil, gas, uranium, rare earth, and fisheries. The Arctic holds an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered conventional oil resources, or about 90 billion barrels, and 30% of its undiscovered conventional natural gas resources, or 1.669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, according to an assessment conducted by the US Geological Survey. Approximately 80% of these resources are expected to be in offshore areas, though. The cold, desertic conditions have so far made their exploitation commercially unviable, but the melting ice can change that and grant easier access and less costly access to Arctic oil and gas. There are also significant deposits of copper, nickel, cobalt, zinc, and rare earth elements needed for batteries and technologies. Russia sees the Arctic as a lifeline in the area of Western sanctions, holding 45% of the region's exclusive economic zone and viewing the polar north as both an escape route from isolation and an instrument of leverage. In Russia, the Norilsk Talnak district, hope I'm pronouncing it right, has vast resources of nickel, copper, and cobalt, and also produces significant amount of platinum group metals. The Russian Arctic as a whole contains major reserves of many critical minerals. In Canada, the Canadian Shield and Arctic territories have high-grade deposits of copper, cobalt, and nickel and zinc. There are significant projects and mines. In Alaska, the Regdom mine in northern Alaska is the largest zinc mine in the world. The state also has over 150 prospective deposits of rare earth elements and significant copper resources in the Ambler mining district. In Greenland, melting ice is also revealing vast mineral potentials, and this includes rare earth elements enough to potentially meet a quarter of global demand, as well as nickel, cobalt, copper, and zinc. Although today their exploitation is limited by technical, economic, and environmental hurdles. In Sweden, the Kiruna region is home to Europe's largest known deposit of rare earth elements, and there are also copper and iron ore mines. Northern Finland hosts large mines and advanced projects with deposits of copper, nickel, and cobalt. And in southern Norway, the Finn carbonate complex was recently identified as an even larger phosphorus rock and related mineral deposit than Sweden's, containing resources for batteries and solar panels. Northern Norway has also operating copper mines. So while the potential is enormous, challenges such as harsh environment conditions, lack of infrastructure, and high operating costs have meant that many of these deposits have remained relatively undeveloped compared to other global resources. But the global push for green energy transition and the need to diversify supply chains is bringing renewed attention to the Arctic's mineral wealth, which is increasingly within reach as ice melts. Finally, there are existing and potential commercial fisheries largely focusing on the continental shelves and adjacent waters, such as the Barents Sea or the Bering Sea, where some of the world's largest fish stocks are found. Climate change is causing subarctic species also to expand their range northward, creating new potential fishing opportunities in previously ice-covered areas. Indigenous people in northern Canada, US, and Russia rely heavily on marine resources for subsistence and have a significant interest in ensuring the conservation and sustainable management of these stocks. The Arctic coastal states, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Russia, and the United States, have sovereign rights over the resources within 200 nautical miles, but other countries are getting involved. The European Union has strong economic interests in the Arctic fisheries, importing a significant percentage of its fish from the region. The EU actively participates in international agreements and seeks to ensure access to its member states' fleet. Distant water fishing nations such as China, Japan, and South Korea are also interested in potential fishing opportunities in the high sea of the Central Arctic Ocean as ice melts. To manage potential fisheries in unregulated areas, the EU and 9 states, including the Arctic 5, China, Japan, and South Korea, have signed the agreement to prevent unregulated high sea fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean, placing a precautionary ban on commercial fishing until scientific research determines how it can be done sustainably. But with these large resources becoming more and more accessible, we can expect their exploitation will start in the near future. So how are all these interests managed today? Well, mainly through the Arctic Council. It is the leading intergovernmental forum for cooperation in the Arctic, bringing together the 8 Arctic states and indigenous peoples to address shared challenges, especially environmental protection and sustainable development. Established in 1996,
It operates by consensus and focuses on improving the well being of the Arctic's more than 4 million residents, while promoting peace, stability, and responsive stewardship of a rapidly changing region. Alongside the member states, Canada, the Kingdom of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, the Russian Federation, Sweden, and the United States, six indigenous organizations participate as permanent participants with full consultation rights, while observers from around the world contribute expertise. The Council's work is carried out through specialized working groups that produce influential scientific assessments and best practice guidance, and it has helped broker key legally binding agreements on search and rescue, oil spill response, and scientific cooperation, though it has no enforcement power and excludes military security from its mandate. But NATO allies fear that cooperation will show its limits against Moscow and Beijing's push for dominance in the region. In fact, in 2025, the chair of NATO's military committee, Admiral Giuseppe Cavo-Dragone, stated that together Russia and China aim to reshape the rules of access and influence to their advantage, challenging openness, fairness, and the rule of law. He added that together they aim to reshape the rules of access and influence to their advantage. In a nutshell, this is what the Arctic has become today, a region with a lot of oil, gas, and rare minerals that raise the stakes and bring competition, confrontation, and militarization. Going back to Russia's military buildup versus US and NATO, it is clear that this will further competition in the region, seeing that Russia has already engaged on a war of aggression.
Russia has shown a resurging interest after years of neglect with new military bases, radar stations, icebreakers, nuclear submarines. The country has now over 50 icebreakers, including multiple nuclear powered ones, far ahead of any other country. Russia's Northern Fleet is also the most heavily nuclear armed fleet. Moscow has upgraded Soviet era facilities and modernized airfields and ports to assert control over the Northern Sea route, which follows its shore, and Project Power, conducting year-round operations and added Arctic defense capabilities, especially against NATO. Since 2020, Russia formalized a doctrine for Arctic governance, emphasizing sovereignty, demographic expansion, economic growth, and the North Sea route as a competitive global corridor. After its invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing sanctions, Russia increasingly turned towards the Arctic to offset economic isolation, accelerating development of hydrocarbons, nuclear-powered infrastructures, and settlement incentives. Russia's Arctic region forms 15% of national territory, but only 1% of the population. And yet it generates 12 to 15% of the country's GDP, making the region economically indispensable. The country has massive investments in LNG projects like Yamal and Arctic LNG 2. Today, for Russia, the Arctic is also an escape valve from sanctions, providing resources and passage. And if this route was to become a major corridor for international trade, Moscow would gain significant leverage over foreign companies and states that depend on it. Meanwhile, the US, NATO, and the West is awaking to this new reality. After decades of neglect, the US now sees the Arctic as a front line against both Russia and China. But the US has only two icebreakers and both are aging. NATO allies are building new bases, radar systems in Alaska, Greenland, and Norway, and conducting exercises like the Trident Juncture and cold responses focused on Arctic warfare. Norway and Canada are strengthening patrols, Arctic forces, and surveillance, and Canada is modernizing its Arctic rangers and surveillance capabilities. And in this context, Greenland is gaining a new strategic importance. And Trump created a ruckus at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025, by threatening to annex or proposing to buy Greenland again. Despite the fact that the United States already maintains a military presence in Greenland, most notably through the Thule Air Base, and could expand its footprint through its agreement with Denmark, Trump framed outright annexation as a matter of national security. Greenland's location, straddling key Arctic and North Atlantic routes, makes it a crucial asset for missile defense, early warning systems, and power projection in the polar region, especially as melting ice opens new sea lanes and access to resources. However, the proposal ignored a fundamental political reality. Greenland is an autonomous territory of Denmark, a NATO ally of the United States. While Copenhagen retains control over defense and foreign policy, Greenland governs its internal affairs and has increasingly asserted its own political identity. Trump's approach therefore strained diplomatic norms within the alliance, raising concerns about respect for sovereignty and the right to self determination at a time when unity amongst NATO members is strategically important. The potential for backlash for US defense shows that it is more about the exploitation of resources and the potential money that could be made there than national security. However, even though ice is melting, the resources are still difficult to access today. China has also asserted itself in this competition. The Chinese 2018 Polar Silk Road white paper claims that the country is a near Arctic state. China cultivates a narrative that Arctic climate change directly threatens Chinese environmental and national security, an argument meant to justify deeper involvement despite geographic distance. Beijing's larger goal is to integrate the Arctic into the Belt and Road Initiative. As part of this policy, China has increased its presence in forums like the Arctic Council and the Arctic Circle, which has pushed Western states to push back against Beijing's narrative and cartographic claims. China has actively courted Iceland since the early 2010s via investment offers and Arctic cooperation framework, trade and research agreements, etc. Chinese companies have also pursued major Greenland mineral projects. Many of these Chinese investments faced political, environmental, and financial obstacles. The licenses of stakes have been reduced, revoked, or the projects were suspended in several cases. Recent reviews note that the Chinese involvement in Greenland mining has declined since about 2019, with some projects ending for financial or regulatory reasons. China has also broadened trade, research, and institutional links with Nordic states, and China has established a formal Arctic research presence through the completion of the Yellow River Station in Ny-Ålesund, Svalbard in 2025, sorry for the mispronunciation, and a long-standing participation in Svalbard research programs, which maintains active but collaborative Arctic science cooperation with Iceland through jointly governed observatory and research initiatives rather than sovereign bases. And it has expanded its polar research capabilities via the growing of its icebreakers, fleet and research vessels, most notably the Shuilong and Shuilong 2, coordinated by the Polar Research Institute of China. Beijing's naval ambition is to bypass US control choke points of Malacca and the First Island chain. So far, we've seen that a lot of powerful countries are involved in the Arctic, and there is a military buildup and escalation risks. Tensions rise from global strategic competition, but also from different claims over the region. Russia claims the Northern Sea Route as internal waters, and Canada as well for the Northwest Passage, while both the US and EU claim that they are international straits. The Trump administration has recently threatened Canada of annexation, and although it was not taken very seriously, this shows that the US has been coveting Canada's resources and territory. Additionally, China's cartographic narrative depicting Arctic routes as natural extension of Asian trade flows framed the Arctic not as Europe's northern backyard, but also as a global highway linking America, Europe, and Asia under China's strategic gaze. This is a stretch, but China's economic and diplomatic power can allow the country to insert itself on the Arctic scene. In just 15 years, the Arctic went from scientific curiosity to a geopolitical hotspot and future maritime chessboard. The military race is accelerating, and the gap with Russia and China is narrowing, but not closed. The 2014 annexation of Crimea was the moment when Western states realized that Russia's Arctic ambitions were tied to its broader revisionist goals. In 2018, the US stated that the Arctic was a zone of great power competition. And since Russian air and submarine patrols near NATO borders have multiplied, the US conducted B-2 and B-52 trainings in Norway and Iceland. There is an increasing presence of Chinese scientific vessels suspected of dual use mapping, and there are rising concerns over Russia-China military cooperation in the Arctic. In addition to this strategic competition, China's rise as an observer in the Arctic Council, accepted in 2013, and its growing narrative that it deserves a role in polar governance adds a new dimension to the geopolitical shift. But this level of competition can be dangerous. The Arctic has a poor visibility, extreme weather, and high nuclear submarine traffic. A collision or misinterpreted maneuver could spark a crisis. Communication channels are less developed than in the Indo-Pacific, and the next great power accident might not happen in the South China Sea, but in the Arctic night. Considering the current trends, it is likely that the Arctic will become a theater of military competition. Russia will continue to expand its bases and icebreaker fleet. Western countries will reinforce their northern flank, and the United States will increase deployments in Greenland and northern Scandinavia, provided that NATO doesn't fall apart. As resources and shipping lanes grow more accessible, deterrence replaces cooperation, and the Arctic Council could lose influence faced against national security priorities. While direct conflict remains unlikely, the region could become a further frontline on global power rivalry, shaped by sanctions, military signaling, and strategic posturing. The Arctic could still develop unevenly without strong governance or shared rules, with some areas seeing rapid exploitation of resources and infrastructure driven by bilateral deals and private investments, while others remain isolated and underdeveloped. Climate risks, environmental accidents, and competing claims could create instability, but also opportunities for agile actors, both state and non state. For powers under pressure, such as Russia, the Arctic becomes a space to bypass constraints, diversify partnerships, and access more critical resources. Unfortunately, considering the actors competing in the region and the erosion of global cooperation, it is less likely that the Arctic could simply become a regulated trade corridor. So, as a conclusion, the Arctic is melting faster than predicted, and a new ocean is forming. Climate change has not created cooperation, but competition, pooling great powers into a region where trade routes, resources, and military positioning converge under conditions of high risk and low governance. The Arctic is becoming a decisive arena where power, access, and control will be contested in the coming decades. Control over Arctic waterways and resources carries implications comparable to Suez or Malacca or Panama for global trade and energy. Russia sees the Arctic as economically vital and military indispensable, while the US and NATO are scrambling to catch up. China is leveraging science, diplomacy, and partnerships to gain access to the Arctic without geographic proximity. Weak governments and rising military activity and harsh conditions increase the risk of miscalculation. And the future of the Arctic will be defined by whether competition is managed or allowed to harden to confrontation.